Azure policies can be used to restrict the creation of certain resource types because they might dash or because teams don't have a need for them, because they might cost too much. What are the three main things you need to consider to implement an Azure policy? A policy definition, a scope, and the resulting compliance reports. At which three levels of the Azure hierarchy can Azure policies be applied as a scope? Management groups, subscriptions, and resource groups. At what level of Azure hierarchy can Azure policies not be directly applied? Individual resources. What is an example of a policy that could be used for resource management and filtering bills or reports? A policy that requires adding a specific tag to all resources. What does a non-compliance report for an Azure policy indicate? It simply indicates that there are existing resources in the environment that do not conform to the policy's definition. What happens to existing resources that are found to be non-compliant after a new Azure policy is applied? Nothing happens to them automatically. They are not stopped or deleted, but they are listed in the compliance report. After an Azure policy is created, what is the typical time it takes for it to become fully effective? It typically takes 5 to 15 minutes. What is the effect of an active Azure policy on the creation of new resources? It will prevent anyone from creating a new resource that violates the policy's definition within the specified scope. What is the purpose of a remediation task policy? It can automatically perform actions to make non-compliant resources compliant, such as adding a missing tag. What type of Azure identity is required to allow a remediation task to perform actions on your behalf? A managed identity. What is a limitation of policy remediation tasks? Using the example of a location-based policy. A remediation task cannot move an existing resource from a non-compliant region to a compliant one. An Azure policy thus allows you to group multiple policies together and apply them as a single unit. Initiative. What is the primary benefit of using an Azure policy initiative instead of applying many individual policies? It simplifies management and deployment, aligning with the principle of least admin effort. In the Azure portal, where would you find a long list of predefined policies that you can apply to your environment? Under the definitions section of the policy service. When designing a policy in the Azure portal, what does the parameter allow you to configure? It allows you to specify the details for that particular policy assignment, such as which locations are allowed for a location policy. What is the purpose of the non-compliance messages tab when creating assignment? To define a custom message that users will see when they try to perform an action that violates the policy. After assigning a policy, where can you go in the portal to see its current compliance status resources? Under the Assignments section of the Policy Service, by selecting the policy and clicking View Compliance. Role-based access control, or RBAC, in Azure is distinct from the roles available in what other Microsoft service? Microsoft Entra ID. In the what are two other names used to refer to role-based access control, RBAC? Access control and IAM, Identity and Access Management. At which 4 levels of the Azure hierarchy can you implement IAM or RBAC? Management groups, subscriptions, resource groups, and individual resources. When a user creates a new Azure resource, RBAC role, they are typically for that resource. Owner. The zero trust security principle of applying just enough access for a user to perform their tasks is known as DES. Least privileged access. What is the most powerful general purpose RBAC role that grants full control over a resource? Manage permissions. Owner. What is the key limitation of the contributor role compared to the owner role in Azure RBAC? A contributor cannot change permissions or manage access for other users. What actions can a user with the reader role perform on an Azure resource? They can only view or read the resource. They cannot start, stop, modify, or delete it. If you want to grant a user permissions to manage only virtual machines within a resource group that contains many different resource types, what is a more appropriate role than the general contributor role? The virtual machine contributor role. What special Azure RBAC role allows a user to manage other users' access to Azure resources but not the resources themselves? User Access Administrator. By default, a Microsoft Entra Global Administrator does not have access to Azure subscriptions, what must they do first to gain the ability to grant themselves access? They must enable a setting in the intra-tenant that allows them to manage all subscriptions tied to that tenant. To Azure subscriptions, what specific airbag role a global administrator assigned to themselves to be able to manage permissions for others? The user access administrator role. In the JSON definition of an airbag role, what does an asterisk in the actions section signify? It signifies all permissions acting as a wildcard for every possible action. In the JSON definition for the contributor role, the not actions section primarily restricts actions related to what category? Authorization, changing permissions. What can you do if none of the built-in Azure airbag rules meet your specific security requirements? You can create a custom airbag role. Key difference: an Azure policy affects existing resources versus new resources. It reports existing resources as non-compliant, whereas it blocks the creation of new non-compliant resources. An example of an Azure policy is one that specifies an allowed dash, which is for a particular resource type, like a virtual SKU. In the context of Azure policy, what is a definition? It is the set of rules that describes what the policy will enforce or audit, which can be built-in or custom created. Why might an organization create a policy to restrict resource creation to specific Azure regions? To meet compliance requirements for users or control costs associated with different regions. The contributor role can perform almost all management tasks except for actions related to changing dash permissions. Thanks for watching.